stops, and we have the kind of recession we've seen over the last couple of years. Well, what does mechanism design have to say about that? It says that we need to create an institution, namely a regulatory institution, to limit what banks are allowed to do. So, in particular, a rule which said that a bank was simply not allowed to make loans to borrowers who had no realistic prospect of being able to repay those loans is prohibited. A rule against lending to very risky borrowers would have stopped this particular financial crisis altogether. Another rule which would have helped would have been a rule limiting the leverage that banks have. Leverage is the ratio of how much lending you are doing as a bank compared to how much actual money you have, how much actual capital you have. Banks typically had very large leverage ratios. They were doing much, much more lending than their capital would allow for. This was a very lucrative policy for individual banks. But collectively, it made these banks very vulnerable, because if one bank fell, then other banks, very highly leveraged banks, would suffer even more as a result of their leverage. They would get into trouble much more easily as a result of their leverage. And so a policy limiting leverage, as in fact the current American administration, the Obama administration, has proposed, might also have stopped this problem from happening in the first place. Well, a leverage policy, a policy restricting the sorts of loans that banks are allowed to make, those are examples of economic mechanisms. And mechanism design theory tells us, or at least gives us guidelines about how far we should go with this regulation in order to strike a balance between reducing risk in the system and still allowing for innovation in the system. So that's I realize that this is a very complicated issue, and I've only given a rather superficial answer, but I hope that this gives you some clue as to how mechanism design can be used to stop this sort of financial crisis from happening again.
My question deals with the United States' very large trillion-dollar trade deficit with China. Do you believe that this deficit is financiable long-term? Or if not, what action do you think regulatory institutions should take in order to correct any potential problem that may arise in the future?
Certainly not sustainable for the long run. A temporary trade deficit, just as is true of a temporary budget deficit, is typically not a problem. In fact, it can actually be a good thing if you're in a recession. Running a trade deficit and running a budget deficit is one way of spending yourself out of that recession. But it's not viable in the long run, because in the long run it impoverishes your country. It means that you owe more and more to foreigners. So what can be done about that? Well, there are some natural corrective mechanisms which operate or which could operate all by themselves. And one of them is the exchange rate. If I'm running a trade deficit with you, that is you're running a surplus, I'm running a deficit, then one way of correcting that situation for the long run is for your currency to appreciate relative to mine. Unfortunately, in the case of China, as you may know, the Chinese government has deliberately prevented its currency, the RMB, to appreciate, or at least to appreciate as much as market forces would dictate. Now, I happen to think, and many other economists think, that this is unfortunate. It's clearly unfortunate for the United States, but it's probably also unfortunate for China, because although it allows them to maintain strong trade surpluses, in the long run, the whole purpose of running a trade surplus is for the sake of your own population. The whole reason for having an economy is so that the people in your country can benefit from that economy. And to the extent that the RMB is undervalued, Chinese citizens themselves suffer because they end up paying higher prices for goods than they otherwise would. So probably the most straightforward mechanism for at least addressing the current imbalance between the US and China, and a mechanism which would benefit both sides, is a currency appreciation. There are other things that can be done too, but I think that would probably have the most force.
Sir, on New Year's Day, the free trade agreement was launched in Thailand and in Asian countries.
Right.
I would like to know, to what extent would this benefit Thailand, especially for small retail companies or stores which are profound everywhere in Thailand?
Yes, well, I was lucky enough to participate in a forum in Nanning a week or so after the introduction of this new free trade area, the China ASEAN free trade area, and I think on the whole it's a development which should help all of the countries in the area. Now, as you may know, some countries are like Cambodia, for example, are more or less exempt from the tariff reductions that are entailed by this new agreement for at least the next 5 years. So the poorer countries in ASEAN will see their tariffs fall only by 2015. But tariff reductions I think will have a positive effect on Thailand and on other countries in ASEAN which are not wholly dependent on agriculture. I think it'll be the agricultural sectors which face the greatest uncertainty. I was saying before that agriculture is inherently uncertain, but whenever you take a big step like eliminating tariffs, you increase uncertainty. So I worry a bit about the future of agriculture, at least temporarily, as a result of this new free trade agreement. But on the whole, I think other industries are going to benefit because other producers are going to have a larger and cheaper market. They will be able to sell without paying the same price per unit as a result of this agreement. They will be able to sell to a much wider set of consumers, and that has to be a good thing. So on the whole, I'm quite optimistic about the economic consequences of the new free trade area.
Hi. My question is whether you think it's possible for developing nations such as Thailand to develop without worsening inequality, because as we move away from low-cost labors towards advanced technology, wouldn't that increase unemployment?
Sorry, what would increase unemployment?
If we move away from low-cost labor to advanced technology in pursuit of development.
I don't think the problem is creating unemployment so much, because after all, wages can always adjust. That is, if demand falls for a particular kind of labor, that doesn't mean that workers providing that kind of labor are necessarily going to be unemployed. What is most likely to happen is simply that their wage will fall, so that they won't be as rich as they used to be. The use of greater technology does pose risk for people who have little education and very limited skill sets. And so yes, I'm afraid that new technology can be a force for greater inequality. But that's why